Okay, welcome to session 21, part B. In this part, I'm going to describe a little bit about GDP, GNP. Um, Here's what we often do. We economists, we often treat what we'd like is a number, an estimate of the total value that is produced in the economy. And we sometimes use GDP as a measure of that, but it's only imperfect. It's definitely not equal to the total value. We may think, well, maybe it's a good approximation, maybe or maybe not. But in this part, I want to talk about why it's not perfect, why it's at best is only an approximation. Okay, and let's see. I want to describe. I think three of the biggest reasons. Okay. At least one of these the book doesn't even mention. Okay. The first one is that GDP only records transactions. Okay. There are lots of things that produce value where no transaction takes place. And if that happens, GDP won't record that increase in value or that value. And here's one of the examples. The book talks about two families, the Brown family, the Jones family. Suppose that the Brown family hires a housekeeper and pays that housekeeper $15,600. When the Brown family does that, GDP goes up by 15,600. The idea is it's supposedly that cleaner household that the housekeeper does is value. And we would like our measure of value to reflect that. And the best we have is how much they pay the housekeeper, and that's 15,600. We say, well, okay, our measure of value should go up by 15,600, and that's what we do. Our GDP, when that happens, goes up by 15,600. Meanwhile, the Jones family, they don't have a housekeeper. Instead, Mrs. Jones does all the housekeeping. Now, Mrs. Jones, let's assume, does just as much as the Browns' housekeeper. Mrs. Jones makes the house just as extra clean as what happens in the Brown family, and so she's producing just as much value as the Brown family's housekeeper. Yet that is not recorded in GDP because no transaction takes place. No one paid Mrs. Jones for doing the housekeeping. Therefore, GDP does not go up. And we say that's a problem. What Mrs. Jones is doing is value, but GDP does not record it. And in fact, um, some economists, I think it was Samuelson, it's not important, it made a great point that says when a man marries his housekeeper, he makes GDP fall. Okay, so you think about suppose the Brown family. Suppose Mr. Brown is a widower, and all of a sudden he decides to hire his housekeeper. Well, I suppose that housekeeper, now Mr. Brown's wife, is still doing the same amount of housekeeping that she formerly did. Therefore, she's still producing the same amount of value, but now there's not a transaction. And so GDP would not record that transaction. So when Mr. Brown marries his housekeeper, GDP falls by 15,600, even though we like to think that the total value in the economy did not fall by anything. Okay, and so there's one imperfection in GDP as a measure of total value. Okay, so that's point one. Point two, how GDP doesn't perfectly measure value and why it's faulty. Um, the book points this out that GDP ignores economic value added. Um, um, let's see. More specifically, it does not use economic profit. Instead, what it uses is accounting profit. And here's an example of this. So um, let's say, okay, that my time is worth $50 an hour, and I'm thinking about painting my house, and it takes 10 hours. And so, um, if I paint my house, it's a total cost to me of $500. Let's say it's an opportunity cost. So with that 10 hours, I could be working someplace else, or maybe it's just leisure, that I value the leisure at $50 an hour. So if I paint the house, I'm giving up that leisure time. Okay. So um, um, so let's see. Let me step back. So instead of painting my own house, suppose it's my neighbor's house, okay, and the same thing takes 10 hours. My time's still worth $50 an hour. Now, suppose though that my neighbor is, offers um, me $600 to paint his house. Okay. If I do that, then my economic profit is $600 minus my opportunity costs. So economic profit for me would be $100, but the accounting profit would be 600. So in a sense, when we do that transaction, the value added, the value that we've created, is only $100. Um, but meanwhile, GNP would be recorded as going up by $600 because that was the transaction. So in a sense, with this transaction, um, GNP would overstate the value created by about $500. Okay, so that's point two about how GNP is not faulty and how um, uh, there are some problems with GDP and GNP accounting. Third point, and this one is not in the book, okay, but this is so important. There's something called consumer surplus. Okay, we haven't actually talked about that, and so you don't need to know that word. So, in fact, this third point I would not put on the test, but I'd still would like for you to know to understand this. The idea is that suppose that, and I think this is about correct, that Cadobo burritos cost about $9. And if you ask me how much do I value a Cadobo or burrito, I would say about $10. Okay, I'd be willing to pay the $9 because I like them. And so we economists say that when I buy a Cadobo burrito, I get $1 worth of consumer surplus because my value $10 is $1 higher than the price of the burrito. Okay, now suppose in this world there is no Chipotle burrito, so every time I buy a burrito, I'm getting $1 worth of consumer surplus. Suppose all of a sudden Chipotle opens up a store, and suppose that I value Chipotle burritos at $20. Okay, so I like Chipotle burritos more than Cadobo burritos, and now let's also suppose that Chipotle charges the same price as Cadobo, $9. And when Chipotle opens up the new store, the burrito store, I'm going to go there instead of Cadobo. Okay, but I'm still gonna pay $9 for a burrito, but now I'm getting $11 worth of consumer surplus, 20 minus 9. Okay, but GDP still records $9 as the transaction. So whether I go to Qdoba or to Chipotle, GNP would increase by $9. Whereas the value to me actually increases more, $20 as opposed to only 10 in the first case. So when Chipotle opens up, the total value increases. However, we would not see that in GNP. GNP would stay the same, at least transactions to me. Okay, so that's the third point, that GNP does not take account of consumer surplus. So, for a lot of reasons, GNP is not a perfect measure of economic value. Yet, maybe it's the best we have. But it's the one we use when we try to talk about value in the economy. Final point on this I'll make is that there's a joke. And by the way, I want you to remember these jokes. There's a good chance I could put some of these jokes on the exam. If nothing else, I want you to remember. You'll probably forget a lot of the content 10 years from now, but hopefully you'll remember some of these jokes. And this one goes as follows. There's an economist who's lost his wallet, and his friend finds the economist looking for the wallet under this lamppost. And the friend says, well, what's the problem? I've lost my wallet. And he said, well, where'd you lose it? And the economist says, oh, down the road about 100 yards. And the friend says, well, why are you looking here? Says, oh, the light's better. Okay. We economists are often guilty of that. We'd like to measure value. That's what we want. We want to find the wallet. We want to measure value. But instead of using a proper measure of value, we use what's the easiest measure of value, this GDP measure. And so we're maybe like that economist who's lost the wallet when we use GDP as a measure of value. And I'd argue that it's not quite as bad as that joke. GDP is still probably a good approximation for what we would really like to measure. It's just not perfect. Okay, so that is part B, and that is, I'm going to finish up. That's all of the concepts I'm going to discuss from the text of the chapter. But in part C, I might break it up in two parts. I might do it in part D. We'll see how long it takes me. But in part C, I will begin some more chapters from the back of chapter 13. Okay, see you there.